Hey everyone. Uh, we are going to give it a minute as folks join the webinar. My name is Mark Hefflinger. I'm the Communications and Digital Director for the Bold Alliance. And we will start the program very shortly here. Waiting for folks to join. We will start the program very shortly. Hey everyone. My name is Mark Hefflinger. I'm the Communications and Digital Director for Bold Alliance, a network of nonprofit organizations that includes the Pipeline Fighters Hub, which is an online and real-world resource and knowledge base, which is putting on today's webinar. You can learn more at pipelinefighters.org. The Bold Alliance originated out of Bold, Nebraska, which was founded by Jane Klebb and originally formed to help organize landowners on the proposed Keystone XL pipeline route who didn't want to sell their land and were facing eminent domain. The landowners eventually formed a legal co-op called the Nebraska Easement Action Team and successfully held up that pipeline for over 13 years. Those easements were returned to those landowners who signed, just as some of those same folks who had fought KXL for 13 years got letters about some new carbon pipeline projects they'd never heard about that wanted to cross their land. So Bold, Nebraska and the Nebraska Easement Action Team and a lot of the resources from the Pipeline Fighters Hub have been focused now for the past 2 years on these proposed carbon pipelines that want to crisscross the Midwest. And we're now organizing with landowners and allied groups on the ground in all of the other impacted states. There's now Easement Action Team co-ops in Iowa, South Dakota, and North Dakota, as well as Nebraska. And there's another strong legal co-op of landowners in Illinois as well. The landowners and their attorneys have so far successfully argued against carbon pipeline permits in the states where they have been rejected so far by the North Dakota Public Utilities Commission and the South Dakota Public Service Commission. And after 8 weeks of testimony so far in Iowa for the proposed Summit pipeline, we found out today that there'll be additional landowner testimony now scheduled starting up on November 6th. And the IUB has said we will also hear testimony on Election Day. So landowners are faced with that dilemma. For tonight's program, we are going to talk about a letter that the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration sent to Summit and Navigator and carbon pipeline operators in general on September 15th of this year in response to a lot of inquiries it received about companies' proposed pipelines. The letter was in response to inquiries regarding the ability of federal, state, and local governments to affect the siting, design, construction, operation, and maintenance of carbon dioxide pipelines. And as was the case in 2014, the PHMSA continues to support and encourage all 3 levels of government, federal, state, and local, working collaboratively to ensure the nation's pipeline systems are constructed and operated in a manner that protects public safety and the environment. The letter also states, crucially, that the responsibility for siting new carbon dioxide pipelines rests largely with the individual states and counties through which the pipelines will operate and is governed by state and local law. On our panel tonight, we have 2 experts here. Bill Caram is the executive director of the Pipeline Safety Trust, which is an organization that has become crucial and a strong advocate for pipeline safety issues since its founding in 1999 after a gas pipeline explosion that killed 3 young men in Bellingham, Washington. Also with this is Paul Blackburn. He's an attorney working now with Bold Alliance, but he's worked on pipeline issues since 2008, including Keystone XL, Enbridge's Line 67 and Line 3. He's also worked, has experience in community, wind, and solar energy development. Just a couple housekeeping things before I kick it off and hand it over to these guys. We have a Q&A button on your Zoom that you can click and ask a question. We will handle those at the end of the presentation time. We'll have a lengthy Q&A. Also in the chat window here on your Zoom window, you can ask a question, and we will get to those. If you also have a question about sound or anything going out or whatnot, you can type it in the chat window. We will be providing a recording of the webinar afterwards to everyone who signed up by email, and it will also eventually end up on the Bold Nebraska YouTube channel. If you're joining by phone tonight, and you have a question, you can text it to 719-428-5952, and I will repeat that number later before the Q&A. So with that, thanks everyone for joining, and I'm going to hand it off to Bill Caram.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me this evening. Happy to talk about this letter that came out a few weeks ago. As you mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Pipeline Safety Trust, and that we were formed after the 1999 pipeline tragedy in Bellingham, Washington, where 3 boys lost their lives. We were formed after that as a watchdog on the pipeline industry and the pipeline regulators in order to prevent similar tragedies from happening in other communities and to other families. And when I first heard about CO2 pipelines, the expansion of CO2 pipelines and the incentives that were going into them, and first came across the potential safety issues, it was clear that this really is should be a fundamental issue to our organization, that really this is the type of issue that we were formed to work on, and so that's what we've been doing. And as I'm sure many of you on the call know, we commissioned a white paper a couple of years ago from Accufax, Richard Kuperwitz, that identified a host of safety issues from CO2 pipelines and the regulatory shortfalls. So this letter came out a few weeks ago. Didn't find that there was a lot of new information in here. I believe PHMSA has shared a lot of this in the past, but it was still good to see a response from them, given this is a pretty complex jurisdictional issue around safety and around different agencies and states and federal agencies. And to see them come out with something was great, but I'm sure some of us wish they would have been a little clearer on a couple of particular issues, and I'm sure Paul will speak to that as well. Want to talk a little bit about one of the things that the letter attempted to take on was to explain that kind of web of jurisdictional issues and who's in charge of what. And I'll share my screen here for a second. I think this here, shows a lot of the agencies and that PHMSA identifies in this. Pipeline safety, really, the jurisdiction of it is really a partnership among PHMSA, the federal agency, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the states, local governments, and emergency responders as well. The states get a little bit interesting. You see on here, I split them into two different circles, as each state or most states have a pipeline safety program. And then there's also the states are in charge, as Mark mentioned at the beginning, of routing and siting pipelines. And those are not necessarily and generally are not part of the state pipeline safety program. And so I'm going to take a bit here to kind of go through how PHMSA explained the roles of each of those circles in this letter, and maybe where they didn't. Clearly PHMSA has the authority to establish basic safety regulations, and does not regulate the siting of those pipelines. And it says on page 3, PHMSA cannot prescribe the location or routing of a pipeline, cannot prohibit the construction of non-pipeline buildings in proximity to a pipeline. The local governments have traditionally exercised broad powers to regulate land use, including setback distances and property development. Um, and so PHMSA really regulates the safe design, construction, operation, and maintenance of pipelines. And those regulations apply to interstate pipelines. And those are generally the pipelines that cross state lines. States are not allowed to issue stronger regulations or their own regulations on those interstate pipelines. That is purely PHMSA's role. However, a lot of states, or some states, have applied for and been granted interagency status from PHMSA, and they are able to inspect those pipelines and then refer any violations that they find on those interstate pipelines on to PHMSA. What state pipeline safety programs can do is fully regulate the intra-state pipelines, those pipelines that are within the boundaries of their state. A lot of the mileage of that ends up being the distribution pipelines, those pipelines that go into homes and businesses. And the state can adopt stronger regulations than those federal minimums that would apply to those. They just would not apply to the interstate pipelines. PHMSA talks a bit about this on page 2 of the letter in the role of state pipeline regulators. I wish they had said the role of state pipeline safety regulators, because states clearly have a role in siting, I would consider that part of regulations, and they don't speak to that at all in this section. And I think they were clearly talking about the pipeline safety programs in each state that PHMSA actually funds 80% of and oversees that program. But we're not talking about the siting part of what a state can do, which they set up the system. And so often they'll put that in charge of the counties. So on that, on the natural gas side of pipelines, siting there's a federal agency that oversees the interstate pipeline siting, and that's FERC. But on the liquid side, oil, refined products, and in this case, CO2, there is no comparable federal agency that does siting, and that does fall to the state to set up that system of how they will do that. The examples included by PHMSA and what they can also do is restricting land use, setbacks, designing the local emergency response plans and training, and building code designs. And I believe this points to a clear examples of incorporating safety values into their siting authority and into those land use authorities. There is also the last piece of those circles I presented in this kind of web of jurisdictional issues with the goal of safety is emergency responders. And they work on these emergency response plans with the power given to them by state and local government, as well as PHMSA. And they train with the operators and under the state and local government directives. And so, PHMSA, State Pipeline Safety Program, the state and county siting authority, local governments with building codes and setbacks, and these emergency responders with their emergency response plans create this web of all working towards safety. And they each have their clearly defined roles. And PHMSA, I think, attempted to explain all of that in that letter. And I think was one of the main goals of the letter. Before turning it back over to Paul, one other thing I want to talk about is just the rulemaking. PHMSA announced that they would be modernizing and updating their pipeline safety regulations on CO2 pipelines, which was great news. I don't think there's a lot of history of PHMSA responding, creating, starting a new rulemaking without direct congressional mandate, without a petition for rulemaking, those things that they took it on their own. That is great. But a little bit of history on PHMSA and why we should remain a bit skeptical of the strength of that rulemaking process. PHMSA has been hamstrung by Congress. They have some real limitations as a regulatory agency that some of the stronger regulatory agencies don't have. There is a strict statutory cost-benefit requirement that no other regulatory agency has. There's an executive order that puts a cost-benefit burden on regulatory agencies. PHMSA has to follow that, but it also has to follow this extra piece that's right in their statute. And that shows that any rulemaking that they undertake, the costs to the industry of implementing that rule have to be justified by the benefits. And that has, I can't think of a rulemaking PHMSA has ever done where that hasn't been a bit of a hurdle for them. When you have something like pipelines where incidents are relatively rare in frequency, but can be absolutely devastating when they do happen, it is difficult to appropriately put that into a cost-benefit analysis. And so that's one restriction. They have what's called a non-application clause, and that specifically in their statute and their authorizing language, they are prohibited from issuing any regulation on initial testing, design, and construction standards that would apply to existing pipelines. And so something like there's been a valve rule came out recently, and it was a long time coming, is very welcome. And the type of valve that will need to be installed near high consequence areas, near population areas. And thankfully that will apply to any new CO2 pipeline that is built from now, but it cannot apply to any existing pipeline. And so if they have a similar standard in the new rule that comes out, any pipeline that is built before that rule is finalized, which can take years, it will not apply to that. Now, things like their integrity management program, the maintenance of the pipeline, that will apply to existing pipelines, but the design, construction, and initial testing standards, that will not. There's actually no prohibition on the release of a pollutant from a pipeline. It is not illegal to spill out of a pipeline. And this came out in after a spill in 2013 in Arkansas, an Exxon pipeline. PHMSA tried to put some enforcement on Exxon after that. It went to court, and they said even though this massive amount of oil spilled into a neighborhood, they actually didn't break any laws. And so there's nothing in the statute that actually says that spilling, your pipeline failing, is illegal. There's also no mandamus clause that would put a higher standard of on the rules that PHMSA regulates. And then a big one is they just don't have enough funding and capacity. In recent years, they've added 400,000 miles of gathering lines to some form of regulation. We have this, big incentives on CO2 and hydrogen pipelines that they're facing down, and the need to regulate those. We've had two really huge gas transmission rules pass in the aftermath of awful tragedies like the PG&E failure in San Bruno, and all of this without a big increase in their staff and their funding. PHMSA has also historically been considered an industry captured agency. For many years, industry was really the only interested stakeholder in what they did. Because of that lack of capacity I talked about, they've adopted many industry developed standards into regulations by reference instead of producing their own regulations. And so our previous executive director at the Pipeline Safety Trust, the way he likes to explain that is that's not the fox guarding the hen house, that's the fox designing the hen house. And really the public is at a structural disadvantage here. We're not as knowledgeable as the pipeline companies. that are operating these pipelines. We're generally not paid for time spent advocating and not as connected to the agency and to lawmakers. And so I think that's fed into this history as well. So I will pass it on to Paul. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Bill. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Again, my name is Paul Blackburn. I'm an attorney and a consultant with the Bold Alliance. I'm originally from Mason City, Iowa. My parents still live there by Willowbrook Mall, 2 miles north of the ethanol plant. It's going to be hooked up to Summit, I believe. That's probably far enough away for them to be safe, but you know, when you grow up in the area, you still care about it. I currently work out of Duluth, Minnesota, and I've been working for the Bold Alliance for a couple of years now. Yeah, so I'm going to do a presentation here and build on what Bill was saying. And some of this presentation may be redundant to some of you who've heard my previous preemption discussions. But I thought it was useful to go back and touch on a little bit of the preemption stuff again, just so that everybody's up to speed with more or less with what's going on. So let me share my screen, and then we'll get kicked on with this. Okay, let me share it here. Does that look good?
Yes, Paul, go ahead.
All right. So, you know, like I said, we're talking about this PHMSA letter, and I think it's important to talk about what it does and what it does not do, and understand, you know, how counties can take the next steps to doing fully effective ordinances that protect their people and the people's land. So first, I want to say that, you know, with regard to federal preemption, if a state government, state agency can do something related to safety, can consider safety in various issues, then so can a county. You know, if the South Dakota PUC, which a lot of people watched some of those hearings, is busy considering safety issues, dispersion modeling, you know, the risks of rupture, emergency response, and all those things, you know, then so can the South Dakota counties. Same with the Minnesota PUC. You know, I worked in the Line 3 case in Minnesota. We had multiple volumes, I don't know, 3 or 4 sets of testimony, direct, you know, rebuttal and surrebuttal testimony on safety issues. And the PUC Minnesota on Line 3 issued their decision based on significant on safety. North Dakota PSC has also considered safety in its Navigator and prior things like Sandpiper pipeline route. So, you know, if these agencies can consider safety and the companies don't freak out and sue them, then counties can consider safety too. People just need to be aware that the companies will say a lot of things about this preemption stuff, but they overreach. But just to keep in mind that, you know, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. So think about what the state agencies are doing, and that's what you can do too. So the Pipeline Safety Act and preemption, let me just get rid of that. And here's the entire text of the preemption clause in the Pipeline Safety Act. A state authority may not adopt or continue to enforce safety standards for interstate pipeline facilities or interstate pipeline transportation. I want to note that this does not say that all matters related to, quote, pipeline safety, unquote, are preempted. It expressly and specifically uses the term safety standards. You know, and there's a very good reason, we'll get into that, for why that is. And then, so what are safety standards? Well, they're defined expressly by section 60102A2. And first off, they apply only to permitted and operating pipelines, not to pipelines permanently removed from service. The pipeline has to be either permitted and intended to be built, or it has to be an operating pipeline. Once a pipeline is permanently removed from service, it's no longer subject to safety standards because there's no reason to keep product in it because it's not carrying any product anymore. Also, the safety standards apply exclusively to owners and operators of pipelines and not other entities. So PHMSA can regulate pipeline owners and operators. It can't regulate local emergency responders. It can't regulate counties. It can't regulate, citizens who live near a pipeline. It can only regulate the owners and operators. Those safety standards apply only to the owners and operators of pipelines. So third, the safety standards can apply to the design, installation, inspection, emergency plans, procedures, testing, construction, extension, operation, replacement, and maintenance of pipeline facilities. That may sound extensive, but it's not exclusive. For example, routing and location is not on that list. Neither is regulation of pipelines after they've been permanently abandoned. It only applies from the point that a pipeline is approved, and then the design kicks in, and then through the point that it is permanently removed from service. Once that happens and it no longer is intended to carry any product ever again in its life, then these safety standards no longer apply. So, and as I said to a lot of county folks, think of these as a building code for pipeline companies. And building codes are different from zoning codes. The zoning code says where something should go. Building code says once you decide where to put, you're going to build something, how is it going to be built? And in that regard, the location and routing issues are similar to, related to zoning for counties, or routing for states. But this is an entirely different process than the building code, which, like we said, you can build a house downtown, you can build at the edge of town, the same building code applies. You can pick a place and the building code will handle it wherever you put it. Same situation here. Okay, so now, and with regard to location and route, here's the full text of the language about whether PHMSA has authority to determine the location or route of a pipeline facility. It just says this chapter, meaning the Pipeline Safety Act, does not authorize the Secretary of Transportation, who delegates this to PHMSA, to prescribe the location or routing of a pipeline facility, period. So PHMSA cannot regulate location or route. And why do they use the word location or routing? Well, the reason is because, a setback, for example, can relate to location, or definitely relates to location, but a setback doesn't necessarily determine the full route. There's a difference between permitting a location of a facility as opposed to setting the entire route for a facility. So a county, for example, could say, we're just going to regulate the location of a pump station, and you can route the pipeline anywhere else you want. The county could route the pipeline for every inch of its distance, or a county could just say, we're going to do setbacks. And that relates to the location, but we'll let the company try to work out how it's going to snake its way through. But again, the Pipeline Safety Act expressly says PHMSA can't touch routing a location, just can't. So, and since PHMSA can't do it, then it's left to the states. And there's just utterly no disagreement legally about the fact that states can route pipelines if they choose to. And, many states do, like Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and other states in different parts of the country do this too. Some states don't regulate it at all. Some states like South Dakota just regulate siting, which means up or no and up or down when where the route is, but not regulate route. So there's just no doubt that states can regulate pipeline route. Now, if states don't, then sometimes counties can, and sometimes it's a shared jurisdiction, like in North Dakota and South Dakota, and in Iowa. And in Minnesota, counties can't regulate pipeline routes because there's an express law that prohibits them from doing it. But the feds don't regulate route, and and the states get to decide if it's the state only, the state and county together, or the counties that get to regulate pipeline route location. And again, this is not controversial. So, but let's look at what the PHMSA letter said on location and routing. And Bill might have read some of these things, but I'm not going to read the whole thing here. But again, PHMSA here is saying that PHMSA can't prescribe a location or routing because of that statute. And cannot prohibit the construction of non-pipeline buildings in proximity to the pipeline. That means somebody else coming to an existing pipeline. And then PHMSA says local governments traditionally exercise broad powers to regulate land use, just like, through their zoning codes, and include setback, and they can do setbacks and property development, in the vicinity of pipelines, but also they can do setbacks for new pipelines. And PHMSA doesn't go there, but it's clear they can. And again, PHMSA just says nothing in federal pipeline safety law impinges on these traditional prerogatives of local or state governments, so long as officials do not attempt to regulate the field of pipeline safety. I think they misuse that word. It's not the field of pipeline safety. They should be more precise, and they should have said, as long as they don't try to adopt and enforce safety standards, they would, in which case they would be preempted by law. There's also 2014 letter on routing location related to oil pipelines. And again, I'm going to read the whole thing, but this was what they said about oil pipelines. And since oil pipelines and CO2 pipelines are regulated under the same statute and the same set of regulations, it's essentially the same answer. It's up to the states to decide, how they want to route pipelines and what the county's role in that is. But the real question everybody gets into is, does the PSA preempt state local consideration of safety in location and routing? And let's talk about that. PHMSA didn't touch on this. That's one of the disappointments of the letter. So that this is something that everybody says, oh no, you can't talk about safety. But yet, we saw the South Dakota PUC and the Iowa IUB and, in Minnesota, that the state agencies have all kinds of consideration of safety. They brought in all kinds of testimony related to safety and dispersion modeling and the risks of spills and everything else, emergency response plans. Again, if the states can do this and they didn't get sued, then the county should understand that they can also consider safety with regard to their reasonable regulatory actions. But again, neither state or local governments can impose safety standards on pipeline companies related to those issues, the specific list of issues, but they can certainly consider safety with regard to other issues within their jurisdiction. But if PHMSA, really regulated safety and location and routing, they would have said so, but they didn't because they can't. So just be aware. And another example is in line 3, the state was trying to figure out where to route the pipeline through northern Minnesota. And they asked the Fond du Lac tribe, do you want it to go through your existing reservation through an existing right of way, or do you want it to go in a new route by Big Sandy Lake, which is sacred to them? And not on the reservation, but the tribe said, well, we'd like to go through the existing route and not by Big Sandy Lake because we're concerned about an oil spill damaging this sacred spot. So that's a safety concern. Would an oil rupture damage this place that's threaten this location that's sacred to them? And and the PUC in Minnesota considered that and said, yeah, we'll route it away from Big Sandy Lake and do it the way you want it, because we know if your concerns about risks, about oil spills. And Enbridge didn't sue them. Enbridge totally supported it because Enbridge really couldn't sue them on that. And we're going to talk about court decisions here real quickly because people are concerned about the Iowa decision, but there's only 3 federal courts that have fully considered the question of whether state and local jurisdictions can consider this safety and routing. The first is the 4th Circuit and came out of District of Maryland. Then there's the South Portland case out of Maine and the Bad River case out of Wisconsin. And all 3 held that consideration of safety as a factor in location decisions is not a safety standard. We'll talk about these cases in a bit more detail. And the 4th Circuit made very clear the field of pipeline safety is separate from the field of pipeline routing. So they recognize that pipeline routing, for these kinds of pipelines is a state matter, and how the pipelines get built, the safety standards is a matter of federal law. So they drew a line of distinction between those two areas. So let's talk about the Washington Gaslight decision real quick. This is essentially Prince George County, Maryland wanted, the applicant came and said, we want to put a big liquefied natural gas tank, in a location in Prince George's County, Maryland. Thought about that, considered a lot of different factors, including safety. They amended their ordinance a number of times and back and forth. And they hedged a bit, and they talked also about the fact that they wanted to develop this area as a residential area, and this liquefied natural gas tank didn't fit into their zoning plans. So they denied the application to build this LNG tank at the location it was proposed. And the court said, well, the Congress didn't intend to occupy the field of pipeline siting, and that even though safety concerns played some part in the county decision, such consideration was incidental and did not convert the county decision into a safety regulation, meaning a safety standard under the Pipeline Safety Act. The Fourth Circuit, just so people know, there's 3 levels of federal courts. There's the district courts, then above them is the courts of appeal, the circuit courts, and above that is Supreme Court. So the Fourth Circuit decision is a pretty weighty decision in this area. And then there's the South Portland decision, where the city of South Portland didn't want an oil terminal built to move crude oil. This facility is regulated under the Pipeline Safety Act. And the company argued that the city couldn't consider safety when it passed its ordinance, and which meant that it was printed by the Pipeline Safety Act, but the company argued. And the court rejected this pipeline company's argument, and just like with the Prince George's with the Washington Gaslight decision, these are all very long, carefully thought out decisions, final decisions by courts after often years of deliberations and evidence. And the court completely rejected the pipeline company's arguments and held that A, prohibition of facility is not a safety standard. B, the prohibition did not establish safety requirements. An outright ban did not frustrate the purpose of the PSA, and the prohibition on federal routing meant that the PSA did not restrict the city's discretion to approve or disapprove a facility. So yeah, they considered safety a great deal in setting their ordinances, and the court said that's not the same thing as setting a safety standard on how to build a pipeline. Bad River case just from 2022 in District of Wisconsin. This is Bad River Band wanted line fight off the reservation, and Enbridge Energy got into a suit about this. Enbridge claimed that they couldn't consider safety when they were deciding whether the pipeline should go through the reservation, the location of it. And they said this is a safety standard. That's what Enbridge argued. The court held that while the band's refusal to consent to easements may be based in part on safety concerns, it is not based on imposition of safety standards. Again, the court held that just considering safety when you're figuring out where a pipeline goes is not the same as imposing a safety standard. But what about that Iowa federal court decision? Well, let's talk about that. First off, that was a preliminary decision. I'm not sure it's going to even be published. It wasn't terribly long and extensive compared to other decisions. So it's not a final decision in that case. And the key thing here is that with regard to the county setbacks, the court preempted them under state law. It said that the state of Iowa law prohibited these setbacks. And the court did not consider whether federal law prohibited these setbacks based on the fact that the county considered safety in establishing them. So this court decision says absolutely nothing about whether the federal law allows a local government to consider safety when it's doing a setback. It says nothing. Yes, there's a little bit of language, general language about the safety or the preemption standards up front, but in the actual holding of the case, it's based entirely on the setback preemption is based entirely on state law and not federal law. So it didn't consider like the provision that prohibited PHMSA from determining route. Didn't 60104E didn't even consider that. It didn't consider the Washington Gaslight case or the Maine or Wisconsin cases. It didn't discuss any of that because it simply didn't analyze federal law with regard to the setbacks. And under Eighth Court, the reason they didn't do this is because under Eighth Circuit Court of Appeal precedent, the Court of Appeals for this part of the country, if a matter can be resolved on state law grounds, then the precedent is that district court may not also consider federal grounds or base it on federal grounds. If it can be decided on a state law issue, it has to be decided on state law only. That's what the court did. So there's no precedent there related to whether the Pipeline Safety Act prohibits consideration of safety and routing. But what about this ordinance, the PHMSA regulation, it's 49 CFR 195-210 entitled pipeline location. And this is the one that a lot of people say this shows that PHMSA can regulate routing. Well, and it does say in A that a pipeline route must be selected to avoid as far as practical areas containing private dwellings, businesses, and places of public assembly. It sounds like PHMSA is regulating this. And the second part of it says that you can't build a pipeline within 50 feet of any private or any structure unless you can provide it with at least 12 inches of additional dirt over the top of the pipeline. So this sounds like, like they're regulating location. Well, first off, this regulation predates, is an old regulation that PHMSA just has never bothered to get rid of, at least the first part of it, because the statute, which preempts which takes precedent over the regulation, just flat out says that PHMSA can't determine the route. Well, that means that the first part's 195-210A, PHMSA can't force the company to comply because doing so would prescribe the location. So yeah, they got this subpart A piece, but it's unenforceable. PHMSA can't enforce it. They can come in and say, well, you failed to consider this the fact that your pipeline is going too near some building, and therefore we're going to make you put it someplace else. The 60104E prohibits PHMSA from doing that. So this is a vestigial, old, unenforceable regulation that PHMSA really should just get rid of. And it's, in the way it's written, it's also very advisory, but it's an old regulation. I've got the regulatory history if anybody really wants to see it, going back even into the 1960s on this stuff. And it's just old and should be, PHMSA really in the rulemaking should just get rid of this 210A, because all it does is cause confusion and it doesn't impose any enforceable standards on the industry. It just cause for confusion and has no practical effect. 195-210B is not a setback because you can construct within 50 feet or further from 50 feet. It just had to put more dirt on top. So really it's just a depth of cover requirement. And again, if they tried to prohibit a pipeline from being built within 50 feet, that would be a location standard, and that would violate the statute as well. And I'm not going to go through all these, but there's some practical decisions. We can get you the presentation about, why PHMSA or why local governments should consider safety and routing. So because PHMSA can't determine the route, it doesn't have any routing permit process like the South Dakota PUC or the IUB or Minnesota PUC. PHMSA doesn't have any permit processes hardly at all. So even if they had routing standards, which they don't, they don't have any routing safety standards, and they don't have any permitting process where they can implement those standards. So it just doesn't exist because the law doesn't allow them to do that. And also the Pipeline Safety Act applies only after a route is approved. So if you think about it, the state could say no to a pipeline altogether. And if it says no to the pipeline, then those PHMSA design and construction standards, maintenance and operation standards would never kick in because the pipeline just wouldn't exist. So at the time that a route is being considered, the federal standards don't even apply. Yes, the company could, on its own recognizance, do initial design review, but that could all be thrown out the window if the route isn't approved. And the route is approved, well, they can't determine the final design of a pipeline until you know where it's going to go, because that determines where how long the pipeline is, where the pump stations are, all kinds of stuff. So, again, PHMSA standards really only fully apply once a route is approved. So anything that happens before that approval, route approval, is before PHMSA jurisdiction starts. But it's important for counties to understand that they can't use their leverage over route to then be cute about this and say, well, if you make the pipeline thicker or deeper, or add these special safety pieces to the construction and design, then we'll let you go ahead. No, you can't do that. You can only say you have to just assume, you can't touch the safety standards and try to get them to do something with regard to the design, construction, operation, or maintenance. You can't use your routing authority to leverage any changes in those areas. All you can do is say, let's figure out the residual risk and what the risks to the people are. We'll pick our route, and then after that, we pass it off to PHMSA, and PHMSA tries to keep it safe. So two distinct things. The county can keep it safe with regard to route, and then PHMSA can keep it safe with regard to its design, construction, and operation. Talk about emergency response real quick. So the PHMSA letter says that it's a really weird language. They'd seen localities consider measures such as designing local emergency response plans and training with regulators and operators, and improving emergency response and evacuation plans in the event of a pipeline release. Well, I mean, they're basically saying here that local agencies do have a role in emergency response planning. So that's good that they admitted that. But they didn't really go into detail about what this means. And then PHMSA also states, sharing appropriate information with state or local governments and emergency planners, which may include dispersion models or emergency response plans, may help stakeholders make risk-informed decisions. So when they talk about who's sharing, remember this letter goes to Summit. So this says to Summit, for you to share appropriate information with such as dispersion models or emergency response plans may help make stakeholders, meaning counties and states, make risk-informed decisions. So PHMSA is essentially saying, look, when it comes to sharing information about risk, that's not setting a safety standard. That helps them, state and local governments, fulfill their obligations to their citizens under state law. And so why can't PHMSA come to a county emergency response responders, the law enforcement, firefighters, and emergency medical folks, and tell them what to do? Well, again, going back to this, what the safety standards are, they only apply to owners or operators of a pipeline facility. And since your county government doesn't own or operate a pipeline facility, PHMSA can't regulate what you do. And that's what Congress intended. Congress intended to regulate the pipeline operators. They didn't intend to have PHMSA come in and federalize everything conceivable related to pipeline safety that counties or cities can do, states or cities can do. And again, just to be clear, PHMSA does not regulate local emergency response agencies or local planning. Again, the Pipeline Safety Act does not federalize local emergency response. Local agencies, need autonomy to protect their citizens. And and PHMSA regulations expressly say to the pipeline operators that you have to coordinate with local emergency responders, which implies, acknowledges that local responders have their own role. So there's important things to keep separate here. One is that PHMSA regulates how company employees and contractors respond to a pipeline rupture through a company emergency response plan. So, this is how the company folks respond is regulated by PHMSA. State and local agencies regulate how agency personnel respond to a pipeline rupture through an emergency response plan. You can't mix these up. You cannot mix these up. You can't have a single plan. And, the state and local governments don't know, can't tell the employees and contractors of the company what to do, because that's undoubtedly regulated by the federal government. On the other hand, PHMSA has no jurisdiction to tell the state and local agencies what to do. because that's regulated by state law and they're prohibited from regulating non-pipeline operators. So there needs to be a local plan for emergency responders, and the company has its own plan, and hopefully they coordinate with each other and their plans dovetail well together, but there needs to be two separate plans. It's very important. And in any case, you know, the police, firefighters, and emergency response personnel need very different planning than the company employees and contractors who are there mostly to secure the site and gather the bits and pieces and figure out what happened. You know, the company employees and contractors are not going to be rescuing people. They don't have law enforcement authority, and they don't have any medical training, and they wouldn't, even if they did, they wouldn't use it because of liability issues. So, you know, they're not going to do what the agency personnel are going to do. They're very different sets of responsibilities. And again, agency information requirements needed for risk-informed decisions do not in any way impact how a company complies with federal safety standards. And you can ask them for information. They can put whatever they want in their company emergency response plans. There's, you know, the fact that you're asking for information doesn't restrict how they comply with federal law. And everybody, I think, understands in government that emergency response in the U.S. is based on a cooperative structure between state, local, and federal agencies. You know, if something bad happens, the local folks get the first on the ground. They deal with it. If they can't, then they go to the states, and if they can't, they go to the feds. And you know, this emergency response, you know, shared cooperation is clearly understood, and they each have responsibilities, and that relates to pipeline safety too. You know, I mean, how emergency response to pipeline ruptures is a pipeline safety issue, but local governments have a role, state governments have a role, and the federal government regulates how the company responds. So, you know, PHMSA, Congress didn't come in and say, look, PHMSA, you figure out the emergency response plans for every police department along your route, or every firefighter along every route of every pipeline in the country. You know, Congress understood it. They weren't dumb. They understood that PHMSA was just going to handle the pipeline operators, and they weren't going to federalize emergency response in the rest of the country. And, you know, that's just the way that works. So here's some real quick chart about the jurisdiction based on pipeline type. I didn't get into the natural gas pipelines or oil pipelines, but, you know, interstate natural gas pipelines, most everything is preempted, except for county emergency response. Oil pipelines, even relatively little is preempted because of the Oil Pollution Act. And CO2 pipelines, most things can be done, but you just have to be careful of the pipeline operator emergency response plans, and of course nobody can do safety standards for any of these pipelines. Anyway, you know, and I just emphasize that this gets a little bit tricky and complicated. So if you're going to try to do ordinances, it's very important to seek good legal advice on this. You know, because there's some subtleties here, so it needs to be done carefully. But if this is done carefully, then you can enact ordinances on consideration of safety and routing, and state and local emergency response requirements that can avoid federal preemption. And I want to thank you for your time today. I think I might have gone a bit long, but I hope this was useful for everybody. And we're all going to sit around or stick around and answer questions. And thank you very much for your attention today. And look forward to talking more about this.
Yes, thank you, Paul. And for folks on the phone, once again, if you have a question for the panelists, you can text it to 719-428-5952. That's 719-428-5952. So we have some questions coming in through the Q&A, and I'm just going to start reading them. We answered a couple of them that folks had posted in the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's the mute, stop video, participants. There should be another button that says Q&A. You click that, and then you can type your question, and we will answer it here live. So Susan asks, what is the difference in regulations and jurisdictions between construction, operation, and decommissioned but remaining infrastructure? She's concerned that No one's thinking about the thousands of miles of empty pipes just sitting underground indefinitely after their commission.
I touched on this briefly. As I said, the Pipeline Safety Act applies to pipelines that are transporting or intended to transport product. And that's 60101, and I forget the specific sub number. Anyway, so Pipeline Safety Act is intended to keep product in a pipeline. Once a pipeline is permanently removed from service, meaning it's never going to move product again, it's never going to have anything product. There's never going to be product in it, so there's no reason to like keep it from, keep it inspected and maintained if it's never going to move product again. Now, the companies always confuse this issue because there are regulations that PHMSA issues about how to abandon a pipeline. So those regulations are there to define the moment in time at which PHMSA regulation stops, which federal jurisdiction stops. So PHMSA basically says, look, tell us when you are going to permanently abandon your pipeline so that we know that we don't have to regulate it anymore. So the regulations say you have to tell PHMSA, you have to purge it, you have to seal it up and disconnect it from other pipeline systems. And once that happens, at the moment those three things get done and they notify PHMSA that this pipeline is permanently removed from service, and PHMSA says, yeehaw, we don't have to regulate this bad boy anymore because it doesn't have anything in it and it's never going to have anything in it again. It just becomes essentially rotting steel in the ground. And so PHMSA has abandonment regulations. Those regulations are intended to define when PHMSA regulation stops. And again, PHMSA doesn't have any regulations that you can't go to PHMSA and say, I got this 10-year-old abandoned pipeline, in my property, I need to get them out. You can't go to PHMSA and ask them to do something for you. You could, but PHMSA would say it's not our jurisdiction. And with this regard, in Minnesota, for line 3, the Minnesota PUC imposed abandonment requirements on Enbridge related to both the old Line 3 pipeline and the new Line 3 pipeline. And Enbridge actually proposed the plan to do this. And nobody got upset, and the feds, nobody came sued anybody. It's just clear that once a pipeline is no longer in operation and no longer ever going to be operated, used to move product, then all those federal safety standards don't apply anymore. So it's up to the states. So that's the answer, and it's a big problem. Enbridge found that the 36-inch or 34-inch Line 3 pipeline would cost $1,000 a foot to remove. So do the math. If it was going through a mile of your property, or if you wanted to get that pipeline off your property, it cost you almost $6 million to remove that size pipeline per mile. And if you want that pipeline out, if the company doesn't do it for you, it's going to cost you a mint. The Canadians have an entire program where they have to set aside money, billions of dollars at this point, to deal with abandoned pipelines. But in the United States, the feds haven't done anything with this. And so if these pipelines get abandoned, your only option in most states is to sue the pipeline company, and then good luck going up against their lawyers and their stonewalling and everything else. So yeah, this is a huge liability issue for everybody around the entire country that at some point gonna have abandoned pipelines on their property. Extraordinary amounts of money and cost if you want to try to get it out of there or mitigate it in other ways. And yet there's no regulation and you're completely hanging out there. And the Canadians have a better sense of it, but the US, yes, just hasn't bothered to deal with this issue yet. But as the pipelines get older all over the country, this issue is going to become increasingly significant.
Thanks, Paul. We have this is an anonymous question, but basically gets to the point of 13 members of Congress recently asked President Biden for a moratorium on these pipelines until the updated PHMSA CO2 pipeline regulations that Bill mentioned earlier come out, which could be as in a year. Essentially, I've heard October 2024 is a time when they could be announced, at which point comments would be taken on them, and at some point in the future, I understand they would be put into effect, and there'll be some negotiation with industry and other stakeholders ongoing during this process, even after the draft, I guess you would call it, new rules are released. Is that right, Bill?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's a draft rule. They've updated the time. The last I've heard was maybe March of 2024, but it'll likely be somewhat after that. But then that just starts what can be a lengthy process of getting to a final rule. So I'd imagine we're talking years before we have a final rule in place.
So the follow-up question is, why hasn't this moratorium occurred, and what actions can we, the public, do to encourage this action? And I think that, there are some folks that have organized a petition, I believe, and targeting the Biden administration with this is one avenue. We have a petition, Bull does. I'll put it up. This is the, I just put in the chat, by the way, the members of Congress who sent the letter asking for the moratorium. And I will pull up the, let's see. Anyway, I will pull it up and post it in a moment. The petition that we have to Secretary Pete Buttigieg for the Secretary of Transportation, which regulates or has authority over PHMSA, which has this authority over CO2 pipelines and is doing the rulemaking. So
I would also say that with regard to moratoria, the feds are hard to get them to do anything, but it's important to keep pushing just because there's a lot of issues there that the federal government hasn't considered, and pipeline safety is just one of them. There are many regulatory gaps that should be addressed. But also, moratoria aren't limited to federal moratoria. California has a moratorium it passed, so states can do a moratoria until they get their regulations worked out. I know we proposed to Illinois that the state government do a moratoria until it figures out its legislation, because it has some real gaps there. And in some states like South Dakota, counties and even perhaps townships can issue moratoria for permitting, land use permitting within their counties. That's a matter of state law. It depends on each state. But it's entirely possible that there could be county moratoria, state moratoria, and or federal moratoria. So when you think about this, don't think about it just as what the feds could do or not do, but think about it what your local county could do and what your state could do. So it's broader than just the feds.
I think that's a really good point. I just wanted to mention that in Illinois, where Navigator this week withdrew its permit application with the Illinois Commerce Commission, which regulates the pipeline portion of this. And Illinois is where Navigator wants to sequester their CO2. So after being full out rejected in South Dakota, decided to pause in Iowa. They are now withdrawing for the second time their permit application in Illinois. The organizers in Illinois are now coalescing around a call for a moratorium in the state, a statewide moratorium on CO2 pipelines, and pegging it roughly to the release of the new federal guidelines on CO2 pipeline safety from PHMSA. I feel like we kind of touched on this already, but how does carbon pipeline regulations differ from oil pipeline regulations and from natural pipeline gas regulations? We talked about how FERC has authority over gas, and Bill went into that a little bit. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, or I feel like we covered it a little bit.
Yeah, I can very quickly. Now there's the statute, which is what Congress passes, and then there's the regulations, which is what the federal agency, how they interpret what Congress tells them to do. And so just talking about the safety standards that PHMSA has adopted as what Congress has told them to do, there's different sections or different parts of that. And there's parts that apply to natural gas, and there's parts that apply to hazardous liquids. There's also a part that applies to LNG that's separate from other natural gas. CO2 is part of the hazardous liquid regulations. And it was kind of an add-on. You'll see there's these highly volatile liquids, HVLs, and you'll see NCO2 or N carbon dioxide in the regs. And so it's kind of this sub part within those hazardous liquid pipelines. And then natural gas regulations have these kind of parallel whole part onto themselves.
Thanks, Bill. We've got a
To keep track of the very different rules can apply to each of these product types. So the little table I put in there, you know, provides some of that information.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going through some of these questions. There's some of the stuff has been covered. What Iowa law preempts Shelby County setbacks?
Yeah, that would be 479B, chapter 479B, which is the state law that grants the IUB routing authority. And I don't want to go into the federal court decision, but essentially it said that because state law grants the IUB routing authority, then the counties don't have any role at all in routing. And that's a matter that's arguable and a matter of interpretation. But again, since that's a preliminary decision, we're hopeful that we'll be able to get the court to change its mind when it looks at this issue more deeply. We think it would be better if the federal court passed this off to the state Supreme Court to figure out what the balance should be between county and state agency jurisdiction, because it really is a political matter for the state about how much power they want to give counties in this process versus the state agency. But it's 479B is what it relied on.
Thanks, Paul. So a little bit of follow-up on the Iowa situation. Where does the existing case that was ruled on leave the counties? Do supervisors have to wait until the January Shelby case is decided before moving forward with local ordinance? Will it be preempted by the state?
You don't have to wait. I think a lot of counties are waiting to see what comes out of it. But again, on some of these issues related to federal, like for example, federal routing authority, or sorry, federal preemption of consideration of safety and routing, you know, that decision, that Shelby court decision case didn't consider whether federal law preempts consideration of safety and routing. It just simply didn't touch on it at all. So, you know, I think that the counties can move ahead, but realize that whatever you do, the industry really hates the ideas of counties being involved in these issues more directly. And, you know, so they're going to push back. But, you know, the thing is that if this decision stands that the state routing authority preempts county routing authority, you know, again, that's not a matter of federal law, and that could, if that holds, then the counties could have a hard time doing setbacks. Again, we think that state law doesn't say the counties have no role. In fact, it references that the companies have to consider local ordinances, zoning ordinances, and doesn't say anything about preempting counties from having a role. We think it should be a balance. Counties know their turf better than the IUB does, and so just like in South Dakota and North Dakota, you know, the state should take consideration of the local ordinances and take that into account, because the local folks know better than the IUB does and what the local land use needs are.
Thanks, Paul. Let's see. There's at least one more of this. What can counties do if a pipeline company threatens to sue them regarding zoning ordinances?
So what can counties do? Well,
Yes,
they
especially.
call their bluff. Remember that if they get sued, first off, it doesn't necessarily cost that much to defend the suit. Second, you can see what the suit says before you decide whether you want to rescind your ordinance or change your ordinance. So, you know, if they sue you, you could look and decide whether there's any merits. You know, sometimes counties don't do their ordinances correctly. And if you make some mistakes in your ordinances, you may be preempted. So you might have made a mistake. So you can see what they do, what the suit's about. You can decide whether you want to amend your ordinance or change it to make it more defensible, you know, or whether you think it's fine the way it is. And then it's just a matter of making sure you have the financial resources to defend your ordinances in court. So, you know, I think that people think it's going to be a freaking disaster if they get sued. Well, not necessarily. You know, I mean, usually it isn't. but it should be planned for, and there should make sure about your insurance coverage and any other kind of financial resources you need for defending the suit. Another thing is that if you have similar ordinances among many counties, then you can share the cost of the attorneys for the defense. So, having a whole herd of counties doing ordinances that are similar means that you can all support each other financially.
And I think you're seeing this in Iowa, at least in the intervener process. You have an attorney, Tim Whipples, who representing 5 or 6 counties, I think, all together in that process. Some more questions here. Let's see. Should counties pass setback ordinances before the permit is issued to avoid vested rights claims?
What was that again?
Should counties pass their setback ordinances before any permit is issued to avoid vested rights claims?
I think it's better to try to pass them before the IUB issues, its permit, because there's a variety of, it's going to create more legal complications. You might be, it might hold up to that particular application, but it might not. It's more complicated. But in any case, it's good to pass them at some point because you don't know whether more pipelines are going to come through. Remember that this wave of CO2 pipelines is going ethanol plants primarily, and a little bit of fertilizer plants. But ultimately, they could do CO2 pipelines to all the power plants as well, and other kinds of different kinds of industrial facilities. So, just because these pipelines are coming through now doesn't mean you're not going to have, 1 or 2 more coming through your county in the future. So it's good to realize that it's not just about Summit and Navigator and Wolf. It's about the future and anticipating that things could continue with additional pipeline applications in the future.
Thanks. We're going to switch gears a little bit here and kind of go a little bit more in the nitty-gritty on a couple of issues. Summit, one of the CO2 pipeline operators proposed, says that plume studies should not be released to the public for national security issues. Does PHMSA consider safety studies about national security risks in their own regulatory work?
Yeah, this comes up a lot. It's a very common claim by the industry to prevent all kinds of information from being made public. There's a national pipeline mapping system, NPMS, where you can look up by county the gas transmission and hazardous liquid pipelines that are in your county. And the operators submit a lot more information than what is made public on that system. There's nothing about the diameter of the pipeline, the pressure of the pipeline. And so if it's in your backyard, you can go on that system and really know very little about the pipeline, even though that does get submitted. And it's often industry says that is a security reason why to limit the information. They also, on their facility response plans, spill response plans, emergency response plans, lots of information gets redacted when any of those are made public. There's part of a spill response plan that's like a worst case discharge. And the industry often claims that is a security issue and that shouldn't be made public. And so that's redacted. And what we find is that the few times when it has been made public after a failure, we see how laughably underestimated that worst case discharge was, unfortunately. So yes, this is a common practice between the industry and PHMSA.
Yes, Congress amended the law at the industry's request in 2010 to allow PHMSA the option of making a lot of this stuff secret. And PHMSA, of course, being an industry captured, went ahead and did that. But just because the feds consider this confidential does not mean that the states have to consider it confidential. And so, for example, in Minnesota for Line 3, they did a whole like 7 or 8 different representative modeling for oil spill ruptures. and the PUC agreed that that should be public. These are, after all, just estimates of where the oil would go and give you a sense of what would happen. And Enbridge fought that to the top of the PUC, but the PUC said, no, we're going to disclose this. And it was all disclosed, and it wasn't like this big, huge secret disaster. I mean, everybody knows that, you know, if a pipeline gets ruptured, bad things happen. But having an estimate of how bad it is doesn't really help terrorists in any significant degree. But knowing what the bad things that happen are really is important to the people who live there. You know, Americans don't want to be designated victims. You know, they want to know if they're going to be put at risk. You know, if this was a chemical plant that was coming, you know, building in your house, or an oil refinery or something, you know, there'd be emergency plans, and they'd have sirens, and there'd be trainings, and if something went bad, you know, the siren would go off and your phone would ring and everybody would run for the hills, you know, with their emergency, with their evacuation, you know, routes and whatnot, because Americans want to take care of themselves, you know. But unless you have information about this, you know, how do you know that something bad is happening? Do you know if you're in a danger zone or not? You know, what should you do? You know, it's safer if we know what the risks are. It's less safe for all of us if we don't have a clue what the risks are. And the industry keeps saying, well, just trust us. You don't need to know anything. And it should all be secret. Well, your state governments can say, forget that. Local governments can say it. We're going to figure out what the danger zone is. We're going to figure out what the fatality zone for these pipelines is. And we're going to, you know, provide you with emergency alerts, and we're going to have, you know, evacuation plans if that's the right thing to do for you, you know, and we'll work with you to help keep it safe. And I think people want that. And there's nothing in federal law that says state governments and local governments can't do that. You know, that local emergency response planning, which is how do you deal with local, a lot of the cops, you know, the firefighters and the emergency response planners locally help local people. All that's outside of PHMSA's jurisdiction. So, you know, they can ask for the information so they know how to do their plans, so the first responders to keep themselves safe, so they know who to go rescue, whose houses to check. You know, they can prepare appropriately just with information about the risk. And that's what we think that is the right thing to do. And again, PHMSA, if the local government, the state government wants to help people understand and require disclosure of these dispersion models, they can do that. And PHMSA essentially said in the letter that, you know, disclosure of this kind of information helps, you know, stakeholders, county, state governments, keep people safe. And it's really common sense.
Yep. Linda had a question that kind of relates to this, about whether companies are required to communicate their links to local entities, which did not happen in Satarsha, at least in a timely manner, or timely enough where it wasn't fast enough that people just didn't find out on their own. I mean, with oil pipeline leaks, most of them that I've heard about were smelled by someone nearby, fishing, farming, what have you. It's not at some like command center where their detection system buzzes or whatever. But can you all speak to specifically whether that's a requirement under current laws, or should it be?
Yeah, operators are required to report a failure, a spill, to the National Response Center within a certain amount of time. There's regulations there, but there's a phrase in there that's like a confirmed discovery, and that makes for kind of a gray area as to when they really confirmed that there truly was a spill. And so that's led to some gray area as to how fast they have to report. Then the National Response Center kind of takes over coordination, lets the federal agencies, lets the local agencies know that there's been this failure, and they offer that initial report. We've been hoping to clean up that language around confirmed discovery for some time to make it clearer, because it really does give the operators a lot of leeway. All of that said, Denbury clearly failed even that standard in the Satarsha incident, and they had some enforcement around that as well.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what happened at Satarsha is that pipeline companies are supposed to use modeling to figure out which communities are at risk. I mean, you know, a community that's 50 miles away, they don't need to coordinate with because the CO2 is not likely to go 50 miles. You know, but the question is which communities could be affected, and it's called the could affect standard under PHMSA regulations. You know, which communities could be affected by a rupture. Well, Denbury did what's called fast modeling, and it completely underestimated how far that CO2 would go. So, you know, Denbury determined that Starshire could be affected. It wasn't an at-risk community. So therefore, they didn't coordinate with any of the local emergency response folks because they didn't think that anybody there was at risk. But they were wrong, and that's because they used old modeling and we think just simply deficient modeling rather than more sophisticated and yes, more expensive, but you know, significantly more effective modeling. You know, so the modeling is really important because if the modeling says your community is outside the danger zone, they're not going to talk to your cops. They're not going to talk to your firefighters or emergency responders. You know, that modeling determines whether they have to coordinate with your local folks or not. So again, you know, that's why it's important to have the modeling be public because sometimes they do really bad modeling and they underestimate what the risks are to your communities.
Thanks, Paul. And just to note, Bill had to hop off. He has another call, but thank you, Bill, for joining us. I think we've got maybe one or two more questions I think Paul can grab here. And then we'll wrap it up here. Dean says, as a Wright County supervisor within 46 miles of Summit coming through and join with the counties in finding Summit, I have residents asking to pass setbacks, but if the IUB doesn't recognize or come to the county on routing or about existing ordinances, are we just spinning our wheels?
Well, I think that's a good question, and the answer to that is whether that federal district court decision on whether state law preempts county action stands or not. And I believe that's likely to be appealed. It's not a final decision, but it's going to take a while to work that through. So I wouldn't say you're necessarily spinning your wheels, but rather, you know, because of that issue, it might be worthwhile to wait on the setback issue until there's a final decision on that federal court case. Another thing you should think about, though, is it would be entirely possible for landowners to go to the state legislature this coming year and say, hey, you know what, let's do it like South Dakota, North Dakota does, and let's expressly say the county, define that counties have some role in determining where it goes through, you know, through setbacks or through other mechanisms. Essentially what North South Dakota say is, you know, that the ordinances apply unless the Public Service Commission or Public Utility Commission find them to be unreasonably restrictive. And, you know, and that was clear, the South Dakota PUC decision, that they upheld, you know, the ordinances that were passed. They said, no, these are reasonable ordinances and we're not going to overrule them. And we want to know what the counties are thinking about where this should go. So we're gonna, you know, incorporate them into our decision. And, you know, the Iowa law is not as clear as those other laws, but you know, but it would be possible to go to the state legislature and say, you know, we want to have counties have some role in determining route. So let's amend the law to make that 100% clear, because the law gets amended and that trumps whatever this federal court does. The federal court only rules on at that point, the old law, and it all becomes moot. So consider that. Consider thinking about how to change Chapter 479B so that counties have an express role in the routing process.
Thanks, Paul. We had a question about rural homes, communities would be influxed with construction workers, etc. Are there any safety oversight to these considerations? And I answered with a text answer talking about man camps, which are what the industry basically creates when pipelines are being built and you need a lot of construction workers, and those are rural towns and there's not enough motels or hotels or anything. So sometimes they'll just build a little trailer to town in your town. And a lot of times in your indigenous communities, you know, there's a lot of issues with the oil industry and extraction in general when this happens in rural communities and what happens. There's a lot of things you can see at the link that I posted in the chat about man camps. We worked with some indigenous folks who wrote a report on Keystone and Keystone XL, and did a really good series of webinars during Keystone XL during COVID, when there was still some talk about Keystone XL. So in any case, check that. And all of the links that I'm posting that you're hearing about if you're on the phone, I will put in an email to folks. Also, everyone's going to receive a link to recording of this by email. It'll be on the Bold, Nebraska YouTube channel, which is where you can also watch hundreds of videos of testimony from Iowa and North Dakota. I was going to set up the computer to record Illinois, but that has been canceled. So that is exciting.
So we have 5 minutes. Want to do one more question or 2 more questions?
Let's see here. Paul, can you see the questions? Is there any that you want to?
Yeah, I mean, this one about the Navigator disclosed their plume modeling of 1855 feet. And why is elevation, temperature, and wind direction and wind speed not considered? And the truth is that, you know, I personally haven't seen their modeling, and I'm not sure exactly if that number was released or they released their whole modeling. But that's why, you know, disclosure of the modeling, not just the results, but what model they use and what assumptions they have, because you can put in really crappy assumptions for these models and get really, you know, limited zones of danger. So we need to have disclosure of the model, the modeling assumptions, and the modeling output. You know, Pipeline Safety Trust and Bold did some fast modeling, this PHAST modeling, and you know, it shows relatively small danger distances. And that's because it's sort of an idealized model. It isn't very sophisticated. It doesn't take really good account of gusts or wind. It assumes that the CO2 will the plume will just grow uniformly like a big egg. It's all very smooth and even. They don't necessarily consider different wind patterns and different times of years, the seasons. You know, and the thing is that better modeling, the computational fluid dynamic modeling, can take a lot of these factors into account. And yes, it's more expensive, but you know what? These projects are multi-billion-dollar projects, and the company should just suck it up and do it. You know, compared to their other costs, these are not huge costs to do this kind of plume modeling. So yeah, it's just an indication of why it's important to get these models there and publicly available, including what the assumptions are. It should also be noted that, you know, it's also the pipeline diameter. So, you know, a 4-inch pipeline is going to have much less danger than a 24-inch pipeline. And who knows, in the future, they may do 36-inch or 42-inch pipelines. You know, so the danger, there's a lot of different factors that go into this. And yeah, it's kind of complicated to figure it out, but you know, it's not rocket science. And you know what? The company should suck it up and do it. And I think that the South Dakota PUC decision was pretty clear to the companies that, you know what, we're just not buying this is all secret, and, you know, and people shouldn't know arguments. You know, they really want them just disclose this stuff. And again, Americans don't want to be designated victims. You know, they want to know. Another thing that they really have to figure out is the fatality zone versus the danger zone. So, you know, at a certain distance from these pipelines, there's no chance of survival. You know, the CO2 come out and go to very high levels, about 15, 20%, and you're in that for more than a few minutes and you're just dead, you suffocate. You know, the pipeline should try really hard not to have anybody within that fatality zone, but we don't know what the fatality zone is, but it exists. You know, if you're too close, you're going to suffocate. And then there's what I call the intoxication or danger zone, which is the area where people could pass out, you know, where they could become intoxicated now with a driving tractor, or they're out in the cold in the wintertime, or using heavy machinery, you know, or just driving a car or whatever, and they become intoxicated or they pass out. That's really dangerous. And, you know, and that's also the zone in which all the first responders should be wearing, you know, breathing apparatus, you know, the oxygen tanks and stuff. So, you know, there's different, we need to know not only the general danger zone, but the fatality zone. And again, the models can easily generate this information so that first responders, so that citizens, so we all know what's going on and people can help protect themselves and know what the risks are.
Did you see any others you wanted to jump on there? I'm gonna get to one or two of these, just touch on
Well,
them.
we're about up to 7:29 here, so
Oh, yep, we're close to time here. We'll try, if there's any other super pertinent questions, you can email paul@boldalliance.org or bill@pstrust.org. And we can get to those questions. Again, once again, we will put the links that we put in the chat, and I think we will be able to post the Q&A here on the page where you potentially signed up for this webinar, and I will put that once more time in the chat. And also you'll get it in the email, so even if you're not at your computer right now, you should get an email that has all this information. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone. I know we've got some county board folks on the line and journalists and a lot of landowners who are working on this. So I just want to say thank you all for taking the time. We appreciate it, and we'll see you for our next presentation.